To nod.
She nodded in agreement with the proposal. She nodded in agreement with the proposal. He nodded his head to say yes. He nodded his head to say yes. They nodded to acknowledge they understood. They nodded to acknowledge they understood.
To shake one's head.
She shook her head to indicate she disagreed. She shook her head to indicate she disagreed. He shook his head when asked if he wanted more food. He shook his head when asked if he wanted more food. They shook their heads in disbelief. They shook their heads in disbelief.
To wave.
She waved goodbye to her friends. She waved goodbye to her friends. He waved at the passing car. He waved at the passing car. They waved their hands to get attention. They waved their hands to get attention.
Thumbs up.
She gave a thumbs up to show she approved. She gave a thumbs up to show she approved. He gave me a thumbs up after the presentation. He gave me a thumbs up after the presentation. They all gave thumbs up to the idea. They all gave thumbs up to the idea.
Thumbs down.
She gave a thumbs down to express her disapproval. She gave a thumbs down to express her disapproval. He showed a thumbs down when asked about the movie. He showed a thumbs down when asked about the movie. The audience gave thumbs down to the performance. The audience gave thumbs down to the performance.
To point.
She pointed at the building across the street. She pointed at the building across the street. He pointed to the map to show the location. He pointed to the map to show the location. They pointed in the direction of the exit. They pointed in the direction of the exit.
To shrug.
She shrugged her shoulders when she didn't know the answer. She shrugged her shoulders when she didn't know the answer. He shrugged to show he didn't care. He shrugged to show he didn't care. They shrugged in response to the question. They shrugged in response to the question.
To cross one's arms.
She crossed her arms when she felt defensive. She crossed her arms when she felt defensive. He crossed his arms and waited impatiently. He crossed his arms and waited impatiently. They crossed their arms to show they disagreed. They crossed their arms to show they disagreed.
To fold one's arms.
She folded her arms and listened carefully. She folded her arms and listened carefully. He folded his arms while thinking about the problem. He folded his arms while thinking about the problem. They folded their arms during the meeting. They folded their arms during the meeting.
To put one's hands on one's hips.
She put her hands on her hips to show authority. She put her hands on her hips to show authority. He stood with his hands on his hips waiting for an explanation. He stood with his hands on his hips waiting for an explanation. They put their hands on their hips in frustration. They put their hands on their hips in frustration.
To clap.
She clapped her hands to show appreciation. She clapped her hands to show appreciation. The audience clapped after the performance. The audience clapped after the performance. They clapped enthusiastically for the speaker. They clapped enthusiastically for the speaker.
To snap one's fingers.
She snapped her fingers to get the waiter's attention. She snapped her fingers to get the waiter's attention. He snapped his fingers when he remembered something. He snapped his fingers when he remembered something. They snapped their fingers to the rhythm of the music. They snapped their fingers to the rhythm of the music.
To wink.
She winked at her friend across the room. She winked at her friend across the room. He winked to show he was joking. He winked to show he was joking. They winked at each other secretly. They winked at each other secretly.
To roll one's eyes.
She rolled her eyes when she heard the excuse. She rolled her eyes when she heard the excuse. He rolled his eyes at the silly question. He rolled his eyes at the silly question. They rolled their eyes in disbelief. They rolled their eyes in disbelief.
To raise one's eyebrows.
She raised her eyebrows in surprise. She raised her eyebrows in surprise. He raised his eyebrows when he heard the news. He raised his eyebrows when he heard the news. They raised their eyebrows at the unexpected announcement. They raised their eyebrows at the unexpected announcement.
To frown.
She frowned when she saw the mess. She frowned when she saw the mess. He frowned at the bad news. He frowned at the bad news. They frowned in disapproval. They frowned in disapproval.
To smile.
She smiled warmly at the children. She smiled warmly at the children. He smiled when he saw his friend. He smiled when he saw his friend. They smiled with joy at the celebration. They smiled with joy at the celebration.
To grin.
She grinned from ear to ear when she won. She grinned from ear to ear when she won. He grinned mischievously at his friend. He grinned mischievously at his friend. They grinned with satisfaction. They grinned with satisfaction.
To smirk.
She smirked when she saw her rival fail. She smirked when she saw her rival fail. He smirked at the joke. He smirked at the joke. They smirked knowingly at each other. They smirked knowingly at each other.
To pout.
She pouted when she didn't get what she wanted. She pouted when she didn't get what she wanted. The child pouted after being told no. The child pouted after being told no. They pouted in disappointment. They pouted in disappointment.
To stick out one's tongue.
The child stuck out his tongue playfully. The child stuck out his tongue playfully. She stuck out her tongue at her brother. She stuck out her tongue at her brother. They stuck out their tongues in a childish gesture. They stuck out their tongues in a childish gesture.
To blow a kiss.
She blew a kiss to her husband as he left. She blew a kiss to her husband as he left. He blew a kiss to the audience. He blew a kiss to the audience. They blew kisses to each other from across the room. They blew kisses to each other from across the room.
To hug.
She hugged her friend tightly. She hugged her friend tightly. He hugged his children when he came home. He hugged his children when he came home. They hugged each other in greeting. They hugged each other in greeting.
To embrace.
She embraced her sister after years apart. She embraced her sister after years apart. He embraced his friend warmly. He embraced his friend warmly. They embraced each other with emotion. They embraced each other with emotion.
To shake hands.
She shook hands with her new colleague. She shook hands with her new colleague. He shook hands firmly with the client. He shook hands firmly with the client. They shook hands to seal the agreement. They shook hands to seal the agreement.
To high-five.
She high-fived her teammate after scoring. She high-fived her teammate after scoring. He high-fived his friend in celebration. He high-fived his friend in celebration. They high-fived each other for success. They high-fived each other for success.
To pat on the back.
She patted him on the back to congratulate him. She patted him on the back to congratulate him. He patted his friend on the back for encouragement. He patted his friend on the back for encouragement. They patted each other on the back after the victory. They patted each other on the back after the victory.
To tap on the shoulder.
She tapped him on the shoulder to get his attention. She tapped him on the shoulder to get his attention. He tapped his friend on the shoulder from behind. He tapped his friend on the shoulder from behind. They tapped each other on the shoulder to signal. They tapped each other on the shoulder to signal.
To make eye contact.
She made eye contact with the interviewer. She made eye contact with the interviewer. He made eye contact to show he was listening. He made eye contact to show he was listening. They made eye contact across the crowded room. They made eye contact across the crowded room.
To avoid eye contact.
She avoided eye contact when she felt uncomfortable. She avoided eye contact when she felt uncomfortable. He avoided eye contact because he was lying. He avoided eye contact because he was lying. They avoided eye contact during the awkward conversation. They avoided eye contact during the awkward conversation.
To stare.
She stared at the painting for a long time. She stared at the painting for a long time. He stared at her in disbelief. He stared at her in disbelief. They stared at each other without speaking. They stared at each other without speaking.
To glare.
She glared at him angrily. She glared at him angrily. He glared at the person who cut in line. He glared at the person who cut in line. They glared at each other during the argument. They glared at each other during the argument.
To glance.
She glanced at her watch to check the time. She glanced at her watch to check the time. He glanced at the menu before ordering. He glanced at the menu before ordering. They glanced at each other briefly. They glanced at each other briefly.
To look away.
She looked away when the topic became uncomfortable. She looked away when the topic became uncomfortable. He looked away to hide his embarrassment. He looked away to hide his embarrassment. They looked away from the disturbing scene. They looked away from the disturbing scene.
To lean forward.
She leaned forward to hear better. She leaned forward to hear better. He leaned forward to show interest. He leaned forward to show interest. They leaned forward during the important conversation. They leaned forward during the important conversation.
To lean back.
She leaned back in her chair to relax. She leaned back in her chair to relax. He leaned back and crossed his legs. He leaned back and crossed his legs. They leaned back to show they were comfortable. They leaned back to show they were comfortable.
To slouch.
She slouched in her seat during the boring lecture. She slouched in her seat during the boring lecture. He slouched when he felt tired. He slouched when he felt tired. They slouched with poor posture. They slouched with poor posture.
To stand up straight.
She stood up straight to show confidence. She stood up straight to show confidence. He stood up straight during the national anthem. He stood up straight during the national anthem. They stood up straight with good posture. They stood up straight with good posture.
To pace.
She paced back and forth while waiting. She paced back and forth while waiting. He paced the room when he was nervous. He paced the room when he was nervous. They paced anxiously before the exam. They paced anxiously before the exam.
To fidget.
She fidgeted with her hands during the interview. She fidgeted with her hands during the interview. He fidgeted in his seat when he was bored. He fidgeted in his seat when he was bored. They fidgeted with their pens during the meeting. They fidgeted with their pens during the meeting.
To tap one's foot.
She tapped her foot impatiently while waiting. She tapped her foot impatiently while waiting. He tapped his foot to the rhythm of the music. He tapped his foot to the rhythm of the music. They tapped their feet nervously. They tapped their feet nervously.
To drum one's fingers.
She drummed her fingers on the table while thinking. She drummed her fingers on the table while thinking. He drummed his fingers impatiently on the desk. He drummed his fingers impatiently on the desk. They drummed their fingers during the long wait. They drummed their fingers during the long wait.
To bite one's lip.
She bit her lip when she was nervous. She bit her lip when she was nervous. He bit his lip to keep from laughing. He bit his lip to keep from laughing. They bit their lips in anticipation. They bit their lips in anticipation.
To scratch one's head.
She scratched her head when she was confused. She scratched her head when she was confused. He scratched his head trying to remember. He scratched his head trying to remember. They scratched their heads at the difficult problem. They scratched their heads at the difficult problem.
To rub one's chin.
She rubbed her chin while thinking deeply. She rubbed her chin while thinking deeply. He rubbed his chin in contemplation. He rubbed his chin in contemplation. They rubbed their chins when considering the options. They rubbed their chins when considering the options.
To cover one's mouth.
She covered her mouth when she yawned. She covered her mouth when she yawned. He covered his mouth to hide his smile. He covered his mouth to hide his smile. They covered their mouths when they coughed. They covered their mouths when they coughed.
To put one's finger to one's lips.
She put her finger to her lips to signal quiet. She put her finger to her lips to signal quiet. He put his finger to his lips to shush the children. He put his finger to his lips to shush the children. They put their fingers to their lips to be quiet. They put their fingers to their lips to be quiet.
To yawn.
She yawned because she was tired. She yawned because she was tired. He yawned during the boring presentation. He yawned during the boring presentation. They yawned one after another. They yawned one after another.
To stretch.
She stretched her arms after sitting for a long time. She stretched her arms after sitting for a long time. He stretched when he woke up in the morning. He stretched when he woke up in the morning. They stretched to relieve tension. They stretched to relieve tension.
To sigh.
She sighed with relief when it was over. She sighed with relief when it was over. He sighed deeply when he heard the news. He sighed deeply when he heard the news. They sighed in frustration. They sighed in frustration.
To clear one's throat.
She cleared her throat before speaking. She cleared her throat before speaking. He cleared his throat to get attention. He cleared his throat to get attention. They cleared their throats before the presentation. They cleared their throats before the presentation.
To cough.
She coughed to interrupt the conversation. She coughed to interrupt the conversation. He coughed because he had a cold. He coughed because he had a cold. They coughed politely to signal their presence. They coughed politely to signal their presence.
Body language.
She read his body language to understand his feelings. She read his body language to understand his feelings. His body language showed he was nervous. His body language showed he was nervous. They studied body language in their psychology class. They studied body language in their psychology class.
Facial expression.
Her facial expression showed surprise. Her facial expression showed surprise. He had a serious facial expression during the meeting. He had a serious facial expression during the meeting. They could read each other's facial expressions easily. They could read each other's facial expressions easily.
Gesture.
She made a gesture with her hand to stop. She made a gesture with her hand to stop. His gesture of kindness was appreciated. His gesture of kindness was appreciated. They used gestures to communicate without words. They used gestures to communicate without words.
Posture.
She had good posture when sitting. She had good posture when sitting. His posture showed confidence. His posture showed confidence. They corrected their posture during the exercise class. They corrected their posture during the exercise class.
Eye contact.
She maintained eye contact during the conversation. She maintained eye contact during the conversation. He avoided eye contact when he was embarrassed. He avoided eye contact when he was embarrassed. They made eye contact to signal agreement. They made eye contact to signal agreement.
Tone of voice.
She used a friendly tone of voice when speaking. She used a friendly tone of voice when speaking. His tone of voice showed he was angry. His tone of voice showed he was angry. They changed their tone of voice to be more serious. They changed their tone of voice to be more serious.
Personal space.
She respected his personal space during the conversation. She respected his personal space during the conversation. He felt uncomfortable when someone invaded his personal space. He felt uncomfortable when someone invaded his personal space. They maintained appropriate personal space in the elevator. They maintained appropriate personal space in the elevator.
To invade someone's personal space.
She felt uncomfortable when he invaded her personal space. She felt uncomfortable when he invaded her personal space. He didn't realize he was invading their personal space. He didn't realize he was invading their personal space. They stepped back when someone invaded their personal space. They stepped back when someone invaded their personal space.
To keep one's distance.
She kept her distance from the aggressive person. She kept her distance from the aggressive person. He kept his distance to respect boundaries. He kept his distance to respect boundaries. They kept their distance during the argument. They kept their distance during the argument.
To stand close.
She stood close to her friend for comfort. She stood close to her friend for comfort. He stood close to hear better in the noisy room. He stood close to hear better in the noisy room. They stood close together in the crowded space. They stood close together in the crowded space.
To turn one's back.
She turned her back on the argument. She turned her back on the argument. He turned his back to show he was angry. He turned his back to show he was angry. They turned their backs on the problem. They turned their backs on the problem.
To face someone.
She faced him directly during the conversation. She faced him directly during the conversation. He faced her to show he was listening. He faced her to show he was listening. They faced each other across the table. They faced each other across the table.
To walk away.
She walked away from the uncomfortable situation. She walked away from the uncomfortable situation. He walked away without saying goodbye. He walked away without saying goodbye. They walked away from the argument. They walked away from the argument.
To approach.
She approached the stranger cautiously. She approached the stranger cautiously. He approached the problem from a different angle. He approached the problem from a different angle. They approached each other slowly. They approached each other slowly.
To step back.
She stepped back when he got too close. She stepped back when he got too close. He stepped back to give her space. He stepped back to give her space. They stepped back in surprise. They stepped back in surprise.
To step forward.
She stepped forward to volunteer. She stepped forward to volunteer. He stepped forward to defend his friend. He stepped forward to defend his friend. They stepped forward to introduce themselves. They stepped forward to introduce themselves.
To bow.
She bowed respectfully to her teacher. She bowed respectfully to her teacher. He bowed at the end of his performance. He bowed at the end of his performance. They bowed to show respect. They bowed to show respect.
To curtsy.
She curtsied to the Queen. She curtsied to the Queen. The little girl curtsied after her dance recital. The little girl curtsied after her dance recital. They curtsied in the traditional manner. They curtsied in the traditional manner.
To salute.
She saluted her commanding officer. She saluted her commanding officer. He saluted the flag during the ceremony. He saluted the flag during the ceremony. They saluted each other in the military tradition. They saluted each other in the military tradition.
To raise one's hand.
She raised her hand to ask a question. She raised her hand to ask a question. He raised his hand to vote. He raised his hand to vote. They raised their hands to volunteer. They raised their hands to volunteer.
To put one's hand up.
She put her hand up to answer the question. She put her hand up to answer the question. He put his hand up to stop the car. He put his hand up to stop the car. They put their hands up in surrender. They put their hands up in surrender.
To give someone the finger.
She was angry and gave him the finger. She was angry and gave him the finger. He gave the finger to the driver who cut him off. He gave the finger to the driver who cut him off. They shouldn't give people the finger in public. They shouldn't give people the finger in public.
To make a peace sign.
She made a peace sign in the photograph. She made a peace sign in the photograph. He made a peace sign to show he was friendly. He made a peace sign to show he was friendly. They made peace signs during the protest. They made peace signs during the protest.
To cross one's fingers.
She crossed her fingers for good luck. She crossed her fingers for good luck. He crossed his fingers hoping it would work. He crossed his fingers hoping it would work. They crossed their fingers before the exam results. They crossed their fingers before the exam results.
To give someone a thumbs up.
She gave him a thumbs up to show approval. She gave him a thumbs up to show approval. He gave her a thumbs up after the performance. He gave her a thumbs up after the performance. They gave each other thumbs up for encouragement. They gave each other thumbs up for encouragement.
To shake one's fist.
She shook her fist angrily at the driver. She shook her fist angrily at the driver. He shook his fist in frustration. He shook his fist in frustration. They shook their fists in protest. They shook their fists in protest.
To rub one's hands together.
She rubbed her hands together to warm them up. She rubbed her hands together to warm them up. He rubbed his hands together with anticipation. He rubbed his hands together with anticipation. They rubbed their hands together before starting. They rubbed their hands together before starting.
To wring one's hands.
She wrung her hands nervously while waiting. She wrung her hands nervously while waiting. He wrung his hands in anxiety. He wrung his hands in anxiety. They wrung their hands during the difficult situation. They wrung their hands during the difficult situation.
To clasp one's hands.
She clasped her hands in prayer. She clasped her hands in prayer. He clasped his hands behind his back. He clasped his hands behind his back. They clasped their hands together in unity. They clasped their hands together in unity.
To hold hands.
She held hands with her boyfriend. She held hands with her boyfriend. He held hands with his daughter while crossing the street. He held hands with his daughter while crossing the street. They held hands to show support. They held hands to show support.
To interlock fingers.
She interlocked fingers with her partner. She interlocked fingers with her partner. He interlocked his fingers while thinking. He interlocked his fingers while thinking. They interlocked fingers as a sign of closeness. They interlocked fingers as a sign of closeness.
To point one's finger.
She pointed her finger at the suspect. She pointed her finger at the suspect. He pointed his finger accusingly. He pointed his finger accusingly. They pointed their fingers at each other during the argument. They pointed their fingers at each other during the argument.
To wag one's finger.
She wagged her finger at the misbehaving child. She wagged her finger at the misbehaving child. He wagged his finger to show disapproval. He wagged his finger to show disapproval. They wagged their fingers in warning. They wagged their fingers in warning.
To beckon.
She beckoned him to come closer. She beckoned him to come closer. He beckoned the waiter with his hand. He beckoned the waiter with his hand. They beckoned each other from across the room. They beckoned each other from across the room.
To shush.
She shushed the noisy children. She shushed the noisy children. He shushed his friend during the movie. He shushed his friend during the movie. They shushed each other to be quiet. They shushed each other to be quiet.
To put one's hands together.
She put her hands together in prayer. She put her hands together in prayer. He put his hands together to show respect. He put his hands together to show respect. They put their hands together to applaud. They put their hands together to applaud.
To press one's palms together.
She pressed her palms together in a yoga pose. She pressed her palms together in a yoga pose. He pressed his palms together while meditating. He pressed his palms together while meditating. They pressed their palms together in greeting. They pressed their palms together in greeting.
To open one's arms.
She opened her arms to welcome him. She opened her arms to welcome him. He opened his arms for a hug. He opened his arms for a hug. They opened their arms wide in celebration. They opened their arms wide in celebration.
To spread one's arms.
She spread her arms to show she was innocent. She spread her arms to show she was innocent. He spread his arms wide to welcome everyone. He spread his arms wide to welcome everyone. They spread their arms in a gesture of openness. They spread their arms in a gesture of openness.
To raise one's arms.
She raised her arms in victory. She raised her arms in victory. He raised his arms to surrender. He raised his arms to surrender. They raised their arms to cheer. They raised their arms to cheer.
To lower one's head.
She lowered her head in shame. She lowered her head in shame. He lowered his head to show respect. He lowered his head to show respect. They lowered their heads in prayer. They lowered their heads in prayer. They shook hands to seal the agreement. She tilted her head in curiosity. She tilted her head in curiosity. He tilted his head to one side while listening. He tilted his head to one side while listening. They tilted their heads to show confusion. They tilted their heads to show confusion.
To nod off.
She nodded off during the boring lecture. She nodded off during the boring lecture. He nodded off while watching TV. He nodded off while watching TV. They nodded off during the long meeting. They nodded off during the long meeting.
To doze off.
She dozed off in the comfortable chair. She dozed off in the comfortable chair. He dozed off during the movie. He dozed off during the movie. They dozed off after a long day. They dozed off after a long day.
To rest one's head.
She rested her head on his shoulder. She rested her head on his shoulder. He rested his head on the pillow. He rested his head on the pillow. They rested their heads on the table when tired. They rested their heads on the table when tired.
To cock one's head.
She cocked her head to one side in confusion. She cocked her head to one side in confusion. He cocked his head to hear better. He cocked his head to hear better. They cocked their heads in curiosity. They cocked their heads in curiosity.
To turn one's head.
She turned her head to see who was calling. She turned her head to see who was calling. He turned his head away from the unpleasant sight. He turned his head away from the unpleasant sight. They turned their heads to follow the sound. They turned their heads to follow the sound.
To shake one's head in disbelief.
She shook her head in disbelief at the news. She shook her head in disbelief at the news. He shook his head in disbelief when he saw the damage. He shook his head in disbelief when he saw the damage. They shook their heads in disbelief at the story. They shook their heads in disbelief at the story.
To nod in agreement.
She nodded in agreement with the proposal. She nodded in agreement with the proposal. He nodded in agreement when he heard the plan. He nodded in agreement when he heard the plan. They nodded in agreement during the discussion. They nodded in agreement during the discussion.
To nod in understanding.
She nodded in understanding when he explained. She nodded in understanding when he explained. He nodded in understanding of the situation. He nodded in understanding of the situation. They nodded in understanding after the clarification. They nodded in understanding after the clarification.
To give a knowing look.
She gave him a knowing look when he told the joke. She gave him a knowing look when he told the joke. He gave her a knowing look to signal he understood. He gave her a knowing look to signal he understood. They gave each other knowing looks during the meeting. They gave each other knowing looks during the meeting.
To exchange glances.
She exchanged glances with her friend across the room. She exchanged glances with her friend across the room. He exchanged glances with his colleague during the presentation. He exchanged glances with his colleague during the presentation. They exchanged glances to communicate silently. They exchanged glances to communicate silently.
To look someone up and down.
She looked him up and down with disapproval. She looked him up and down with disapproval. He looked her up and down to assess her appearance. He looked her up and down to assess her appearance. They looked each other up and down before speaking. They looked each other up and down before speaking.
To look down.
She looked down when she felt embarrassed. She looked down when she felt embarrassed. He looked down at his feet in shame. He looked down at his feet in shame. They looked down to avoid eye contact. They looked down to avoid eye contact.
To look up.
She looked up at the sky to see the stars. She looked up at the sky to see the stars. He looked up from his book when she entered. He looked up from his book when she entered. They looked up to see what was happening. They looked up to see what was happening.
To peer.
She peered through the window to see outside. She peered through the window to see outside. He peered at the small print to read it. He peered at the small print to read it. They peered into the dark room cautiously. They peered into the dark room cautiously.
To squint.
She squinted to see the distant sign. She squinted to see the distant sign. He squinted in the bright sunlight. He squinted in the bright sunlight. They squinted to read the small text. They squinted to read the small text.
To blink.
She blinked rapidly when something got in her eye. She blinked rapidly when something got in her eye. He blinked in surprise at the news. He blinked in surprise at the news. They blinked to clear their vision. They blinked to clear their vision.
To wink knowingly.
She winked knowingly at her friend. She winked knowingly at her friend. He winked knowingly to show he understood the joke. He winked knowingly to show he understood the joke. They winked knowingly at each other. They winked knowingly at each other.
To purse one's lips.
She pursed her lips in disapproval. She pursed her lips in disapproval. He pursed his lips while thinking. He pursed his lips while thinking. They pursed their lips to show they were not pleased. They pursed their lips to show they were not pleased.
To lick one's lips.
She licked her lips in anticipation of the meal. She licked her lips in anticipation of the meal. He licked his lips when he saw the dessert. He licked his lips when he saw the dessert. They licked their lips before taking a bite. They licked their lips before taking a bite.
To press one's lips together.
She pressed her lips together to keep from speaking. She pressed her lips together to keep from speaking. He pressed his lips together in determination. He pressed his lips together in determination. They pressed their lips together to suppress a smile. They pressed their lips together to suppress a smile.
To part one's lips.
She parted her lips slightly in surprise. She parted her lips slightly in surprise. He parted his lips to speak but stopped. He parted his lips to speak but stopped. They parted their lips in anticipation. They parted their lips in anticipation.
To clench one's jaw.
She clenched her jaw in anger. She clenched her jaw in anger. He clenched his jaw to control his emotions. He clenched his jaw to control his emotions. They clenched their jaws in frustration. They clenched their jaws in frustration.
To grit one's teeth.
She gritted her teeth in pain. She gritted her teeth in pain. He gritted his teeth to endure the difficult situation. He gritted his teeth to endure the difficult situation. They gritted their teeth and continued working. They gritted their teeth and continued working.
To bare one's teeth.
The dog bared its teeth in aggression. The dog bared its teeth in aggression. She bared her teeth in a forced smile. She bared her teeth in a forced smile. They bared their teeth as a warning. They bared their teeth as a warning.
To show one's teeth.
She showed her teeth when she smiled widely. She showed her teeth when she smiled widely. He showed his teeth in a big grin. He showed his teeth in a big grin. They showed their teeth when laughing. They showed their teeth when laughing.
To raise one's chin.
She raised her chin defiantly. She raised her chin defiantly. He raised his chin to show confidence. He raised his chin to show confidence. They raised their chins with pride. They raised their chins with pride.
To lower one's chin.
She lowered her chin in shame. She lowered her chin in shame. He lowered his chin to his chest when sad. He lowered his chin to his chest when sad. They lowered their chins in defeat. They lowered their chins in defeat.
To jut out one's chin.
She jutted out her chin defiantly. She jutted out her chin defiantly. He jutted out his chin to show determination. He jutted out his chin to show determination. They jutted out their chins in challenge. They jutted out their chins in challenge.
To touch one's face.
She touched her face nervously during the interview. She touched her face nervously during the interview. He touched his face when he was thinking. He touched his face when he was thinking. They touched their faces unconsciously. They touched their faces unconsciously.
To cover one's face.
She covered her face with her hands in embarrassment. She covered her face with her hands in embarrassment. He covered his face to hide his emotions. He covered his face to hide his emotions. They covered their faces when they laughed. They covered their faces when they laughed.
To hide one's face.
She hid her face in her hands when she cried. She hid her face in her hands when she cried. He hid his face behind a book. He hid his face behind a book. They hid their faces to avoid being recognized. They hid their faces to avoid being recognized.
To turn one's face away.
She turned her face away from the unpleasant sight. She turned her face away from the unpleasant sight. He turned his face away to hide his tears. He turned his face away to hide his tears. They turned their faces away in disgust. They turned their faces away in disgust.
To face someone directly.
She faced him directly to show she was serious. She faced him directly to show she was serious. He faced her directly during the confrontation. He faced her directly during the confrontation. They faced each other directly to resolve the issue. They faced each other directly to resolve the issue.
To turn one's back on someone.
She turned her back on him when he lied. She turned her back on him when he lied. He turned his back on his former friend. He turned his back on his former friend. They turned their backs on the problem. They turned their backs on the problem.
To have one's back to someone.
She had her back to him while working. She had her back to him while working. He had his back to the door when he heard the noise. He had his back to the door when he heard the noise. They had their backs to each other during the argument. They had their backs to each other during the argument.
To stand side by side.
She stood side by side with her friend. She stood side by side with her friend. He stood side by side with his teammates. He stood side by side with his teammates. They stood side by side in solidarity. They stood side by side in solidarity.
To stand face to face.
She stood face to face with her opponent. She stood face to face with her opponent. He stood face to face with his boss during the discussion. He stood face to face with his boss during the discussion. They stood face to have a serious conversation. They stood face to have a serious conversation.
To sit facing someone.
She sat facing him across the table. She sat facing him across the table. He sat facing her during the interview. He sat facing her during the interview. They sat facing each other to talk. They sat facing each other to talk.
To communicate.
She communicated her feelings through gestures. She communicated her feelings through gestures. He communicated without words using body language. He communicated without words using body language. They communicated effectively through nonverbal cues. They communicated effectively through nonverbal cues.
To express.
She expressed her approval with a smile. She expressed her approval with a smile. He expressed his disagreement by shaking his head. He expressed his disagreement by shaking his head. They expressed their emotions through facial expressions. They expressed their emotions through facial expressions.
To show.
She showed her interest by leaning forward. She showed her interest by leaning forward. He showed confidence with his posture. He showed confidence with his posture. They showed their agreement by nodding. They showed their agreement by nodding.
To indicate.
She indicated she was ready by raising her hand. She indicated she was ready by raising her hand. He indicated the direction by pointing. He indicated the direction by pointing. They indicated their approval with thumbs up. They indicated their approval with thumbs up.
To signal.
She signaled for quiet by putting her finger to her lips. She signaled for quiet by putting her finger to her lips. He signaled to come closer by waving. He signaled to come closer by waving. They signaled each other with eye contact. They signaled each other with eye contact.
To demonstrate.
She demonstrated her frustration by crossing her arms. She demonstrated her frustration by crossing her arms. He demonstrated his understanding by nodding. He demonstrated his understanding by nodding. They demonstrated their support with applause. They demonstrated their support with applause.
To reveal.
Her expression revealed her true feelings. Her expression revealed her true feelings. His body language revealed he was nervous. His body language revealed he was nervous. They revealed their emotions through gestures. They revealed their emotions through gestures.
To hide.
She tried to hide her disappointment with a smile. She tried to hide her disappointment with a smile. He hid his nervousness by crossing his arms. He hid his nervousness by crossing his arms. They hid their true feelings behind a mask. They hid their true feelings behind a mask.
To display.
She displayed confidence through her posture. She displayed confidence through her posture. He displayed anger with his facial expression. He displayed anger with his facial expression. They displayed their happiness with big smiles. They displayed their happiness with big smiles.
To convey.
She conveyed her message through gestures. She conveyed her message through gestures. He conveyed his approval with a thumbs up. He conveyed his approval with a thumbs up. They conveyed their emotions without words. They conveyed their emotions without words.
To interpret.
She interpreted his body language as defensive. She interpreted his body language as defensive. He interpreted the gesture as a sign of approval. He interpreted the gesture as a sign of approval. They interpreted the facial expression correctly. They interpreted the facial expression correctly.
To read.
She could read his body language easily. She could read his body language easily. He read the situation from their expressions. He read the situation from their expressions. They read each other's gestures perfectly. They read each other's gestures perfectly.
To understand.
She understood his message from his gestures. She understood his message from his gestures. He understood her feelings through her expression. He understood her feelings through her expression. They understood each other without speaking. They understood each other without speaking.
To notice.
She noticed his nervous gestures. She noticed his nervous gestures. He noticed her change in expression. He noticed her change in expression. They noticed the body language signals. They noticed the body language signals.
To observe.
She observed his body language carefully. She observed his body language carefully. He observed the gestures of the group. He observed the gestures of the group. They observed nonverbal communication patterns. They observed nonverbal communication patterns.
To watch.
She watched his facial expressions closely. She watched his facial expressions closely. He watched for signs of agreement. He watched for signs of agreement. They watched each other's body language. They watched each other's body language.
To see.
She could see he was uncomfortable from his posture. She could see he was uncomfortable from his posture. He saw her approval in her smile. He saw her approval in her smile. They saw the gesture from across the room. They saw the gesture from across the room.
To look.
She looked at his expression to understand. She looked at his expression to understand. He looked for nonverbal cues. He looked for nonverbal cues. They looked at each other's gestures. They looked at each other's gestures.
To recognize.
She recognized the gesture as a sign of approval. She recognized the gesture as a sign of approval. He recognized her expression of surprise. He recognized her expression of surprise. They recognized the body language patterns. They recognized the body language patterns.
To respond.
She responded with a nod of agreement. She responded with a nod of agreement. He responded to the gesture with a smile. He responded to the gesture with a smile. They responded to each other's body language. They responded to each other's body language.
To react.
She reacted to his gesture with surprise. She reacted to his gesture with surprise. He reacted by crossing his arms defensively. He reacted by crossing his arms defensively. They reacted differently to the same gesture. They reacted differently to the same gesture.
To mirror.
She mirrored his body language unconsciously. She mirrored his body language unconsciously. He mirrored her gestures to build rapport. He mirrored her gestures to build rapport. They mirrored each other's postures. They mirrored each other's postures.
To copy.
She copied his gesture to show understanding. She copied his gesture to show understanding. He copied her body language subconsciously. He copied her body language subconsciously. They copied each other's movements. They copied each other's movements.
To imitate.
She imitated his gesture playfully. She imitated his gesture playfully. He imitated her expression to make her laugh. He imitated her expression to make her laugh. They imitated each other's gestures. They imitated each other's gestures.
To match.
She matched his energy with her body language. She matched his energy with her body language. His gestures matched his words. His gestures matched his words. They matched each other's expressions. They matched each other's expressions.
To control.
She tried to control her facial expressions. She tried to control her facial expressions. He controlled his body language during the interview. He controlled his body language during the interview. They controlled their gestures to appear calm. They controlled their gestures to appear calm.
To manage.
She managed to hide her nervousness with a smile. She managed to hide her nervousness with a smile. He managed his body language professionally. He managed his body language professionally. They managed their expressions carefully. They managed their expressions carefully.
To adjust.
She adjusted her posture to appear more confident. She adjusted her posture to appear more confident. He adjusted his body language to match the situation. He adjusted his body language to match the situation. They adjusted their gestures based on the audience. They adjusted their gestures based on the audience.
To change.
She changed her expression when she heard the news. She changed her expression when she heard the news. His body language changed when he became nervous. His body language changed when he became nervous. They changed their gestures to be more appropriate. They changed their gestures to be more appropriate.
To adapt.
She adapted her gestures to the cultural context. She adapted her gestures to the cultural context. He adapted his body language to the formal setting. He adapted his body language to the formal setting. They adapted their expressions to the situation. They adapted their expressions to the situation.
To use.
She used gestures to emphasize her point. She used gestures to emphasize her point. He used body language to communicate effectively. He used body language to communicate effectively. They used nonverbal cues to understand each other. They used nonverbal cues to understand each other.
To emphasize.
She emphasized her words with hand gestures. She emphasized her words with hand gestures. He emphasized his point by pointing. He emphasized his point by pointing. They emphasized their agreement with enthusiastic nods. They emphasized their agreement with enthusiastic nods.
To reinforce.
She reinforced her message with body language. She reinforced her message with body language. He reinforced his words with gestures. He reinforced his words with gestures. They reinforced their agreement with nonverbal signals. They reinforced their agreement with nonverbal signals.
To support.
Her gestures supported what she was saying. Her gestures supported what she was saying. His body language supported his confident words. His body language supported his confident words. They supported each other's messages with gestures. They supported each other's messages with gestures.
To contradict.
Her body language contradicted her words. Her body language contradicted her words. His expression contradicted what he was saying. His expression contradicted what he was saying. They noticed when gestures contradicted the message. They noticed when gestures contradicted the message.
To confirm.
She confirmed her agreement with a nod. She confirmed her agreement with a nod. His gesture confirmed what he was saying. His gesture confirmed what he was saying. They confirmed their understanding through body language. They confirmed their understanding through body language.
To agree.
She agreed by nodding her head. She agreed by nodding her head. He agreed with a thumbs-up gesture. He agreed with a thumbs-up gesture. They agreed through nonverbal signals. They agreed through nonverbal signals.
To disagree.
She disagreed by shaking her head. She disagreed by shaking her head. He disagreed with a frown. He disagreed with a frown. They disagreed through their body language. They disagreed through their body language.
To approve.
She approved with a smile and a nod. She approved with a smile and a nod. He approved by giving a thumbs up. He approved by giving a thumbs up. They approved through positive body language. They approved through positive body language.
To disapprove.
She disapproved with a frown. She disapproved with a frown. He disapproved by shaking his head. He disapproved by shaking his head. They disapproved through negative gestures. They disapproved through negative gestures.
To accept.
She accepted the invitation with a happy nod. She accepted the invitation with a happy nod. He accepted the offer with a handshake. He accepted the offer with a handshake. They accepted through welcoming gestures. They accepted through welcoming gestures.
To reject.
She rejected the idea by turning away. She rejected the idea by turning away. He rejected the proposal with a negative gesture. He rejected the proposal with a negative gesture. They rejected through dismissive body language. They rejected through dismissive body language.
To welcome.
She welcomed him with open arms. She welcomed him with open arms. He welcomed the guests with a warm smile. He welcomed the guests with a warm smile. They welcomed each other with friendly gestures. They welcomed each other with friendly gestures.
To greet.
She greeted him with a wave. She greeted him with a wave. He greeted her with a handshake. He greeted her with a handshake. They greeted each other with hugs. They greeted each other with hugs.
To say goodbye.
She said goodbye with a wave. She said goodbye with a wave. He said goodbye with a hug. He said goodbye with a hug. They said goodbye with handshakes. They said goodbye with handshakes.